Well, a warm welcome to today's talk, Wednesday the 26th of January. Now, mostly today I want to look at the new round of the REACT study, which is the largest antigen study in the world, looking at large numbers of people in England. But just before we get on to that, I just want to do a quick orientation. So this is new daily confirmed cases per million people. Now, we see countries that are very highly vaccinated, like Israel and Denmark, getting huge numbers of breakthrough infections. So there's no question that the Omicron symptomatic is smashing through the vaccine-induced defences. But it is important to remember for people that have not had natural infection, the vaccine is vital to keep them out of hospital. So we need to keep that perspective. Now, so Israel, Denmark, very high cases per capita. France is going up. Gibraltar, also very highly vaccinated, of course. Cases remaining high, I would say, in Belgium. In Gibraltar, and exactly the same figures as Belgium, coincidentally. Netherlands increasing with Omicron. United States, where it looks like things are just starting to go down in the United States, as we've looked at. Germany, they're still going up. United Kingdom, from that, they're levelish, but we do believe... Well, actually, the United Kingdom is a bit complicated. It has been going down, but there's been just a little blip lately, a bit of an uptick lately. So we'll have to discuss that separately at some point. Ireland going down nicely, reflecting the short-lived Omicron wave in Ireland. Japan, Canada and India. And I haven't got it on that graph there, but New Zealand... When you look at New Zealand on this graph, it actually looks flat, but in actual fact, there are some community cases in New Zealand now. And we'll be looking at some of the implications for that later on. Basically, it means Omicron is going to spread around New Zealand. So if you're in New Zealand now, I would expect to be infected with Omicron over the next couple of months, is the likely scenario, I believe. So that was cases. Now, hospitalisations. Now, we see that the United States is still high, as indeed is France. Now, in the United States, it's partly the financial incentive that they get reimbursement if people are diagnosed with COVID when they're admitted. So they're certainly on the lookout for that because of the financial reasons. But it's also because of the comorbidities in the States causing high levels of hospitalisation. France, I think that reflects the increasing cases lately. Belgium, Canada, United Kingdom, hospitalisation slightly up in the United Kingdom. Israel, given the very high number of cases in Israel, relatively low, well, very low levels of hospitalisation, really. Ireland, Denmark, Japan, Netherlands. So, if, for example, just look at Israel there. So that's where Israel is in the sort of hierarchy of hospitalisations. Just a little bit below the UK at the moment, has been a little bit above. But when we look at the cases, wow, I mean, they're right up there. So we see that vaccination and previous infection is protecting against severe outcomes, which is good. Now, but as we'll see, it's not protecting against symptomatic disease, or as we have seen, and we'll see that further. So this is the REACT study, real-time assessment of community transmission findings, round 17. So this has been done pretty well every month, every 4 or 5 weeks since the start of the pandemic. And it's the REACT 1. The REACT 1, as you'll probably remember, is the study of the antigens. That's the actual virus itself. The REACT 2 is the study of the antibodies, the body's reaction to the virus. But this is REACT 1, just looking at antigen levels. And it's quite clever. It's conducted with Ipse Mori, which of course is the polling organisation. So very professionally conducted study, funded by the UK government. Headline here: 65% of the 65% of the infected said they had already had previously tested positive for COVID-19. So 65% of people who tested positive for Omicron in this wave reported that they had previously tested positive. So conclusive evidence here of reinfection. People are getting symptomatic disease. People are testing positive after previous infection, but they're much less likely to get hospitalised. Imperial College London, lots of references there. So the background here: rapid transmission of the SARS-CoV-2 variant has led to the highest ever recorded case incidence levels in many countries around the world. As we've said, Omicron is the new pandemic. The real-time PCR test results: self-administered nose and throat swabs, randomly assigned throughout England. So it's a big study. They've got They sent out a lot more than this, but they've got over 100,000 results back. Patients or individuals from 5 years of age and over. Data here was collected between the 5th of January and the 20th of January 2020. And they're able to look at temporal, socio-demographic, geographical spread of the virus. They can look at all sorts. It's a really sophisticated study. They can look at viral loads. They look at the genome and the sequence data for positive swabs. So they can look at all. So if it's positive, in other words, they do a genomic analysis. So the results. Swab positivity was 4.41%. Now, we have seen higher positivities in other countries, much higher in other countries, but this is the highest we've ever seen in the UK or has been officially recorded. Threefold higher than it was in December 2021, which was Delta. So we see that basically there's massively more community transmission of Omicron, massively more, as we anticipated and as we've always maintained. So 1,400 sequence positive to the 16th of January, which is the time they've had to do the genomic sequences up to. 99% were Omicron, including 6, that's 0.43% of the BA2 variant sublineage. Now, if you watched yesterday's video, and I apologise for the poor sound yesterday, I think we've fixed it now, but the BA2 lineage is an Omicron variant. It didn't come from the BA1. They've both been they're both developed separately from some common ancestor, probably a couple of months ago. And it looks like the BA2 is replacing the BA1. It's transmitting much more faster, but it's not making people sicker. So if anything, this could be good news because it means that the herd immunity is going to develop quicker. But it's probably twice as transmissible as the BA1. So this is going to become the predominant strain. But it's not a cause for concern. It just means that it's going to spread around quicker and that the waves should, more people will be infected more quickly. But there again, the wave is going to be more compressed. It doesn't seem to be causing more hospitalizations or more severe disease. 14.1% were Delta. So Delta now is probably just about gone. So remember, as of the 16th of January, it was 1% Delta. I would be amazed if Delta's, well, I would expect Delta now to be 0.1% or something like that. So Omicron's completely replaced Delta, as we predicted. Remember, there was Chris Whitty was talking about this and he said we had 2 pandemics. I said, I don't think we have. I think it's just a very transitory phenomena, and turns out I was right. Delta has been completely replaced by Omicron. Within round 17, prevalence was decreasing overall. So up to, when was it? Up to the 20th of January, prevalence was going down, but it was increasing in children aged 5 to 17. So this was just like a snapshot within the time period, because they do temporal analysis. That was between the 5th and the 20th of January. Swab positivity in the more at-risk 75-year-olds. Again, high community prevalence in older people with a greater risk of hospitalisation. It is transpiring through into some increase in hospitalisation, but not massive. Doesn't mean say hospitals aren't severely stretched. My hospital colleagues are very stretched, and they've got a big backlog of cases as well. So it's not saying there's no problem, but it's in terms of the Omicron load on the health service, it is decreasing compared to the Delta, which is good. Large multiple occupancy households, the odds ratio was 1.66, about 66% more likely to be positive if you live in a large household. About 24% odds ratio 1.24, more likely to be positive in the urban areas. Now, I think this just reflected, well, partly it reflected the period of time that the cities were infected first. But also we know that the incidence in other parts of the country has never reached as high as it was in London. So London was particularly high, probably due to lower vaccination uptake rates in certain sectors of the population. And now the most, so people in more deprived areas, economically deprived areas, 33% more likely to be infected. But I'm not too sure about this, because in what we might call, I don't like the term deprived areas, but what people call deprived areas, my thinking is that people would be more likely to do the swab if they were symptomatic. Therefore, you would pick up more people. So I don't really think we can interpret that as a genuine result, to be quite honest. This would appear to say the odds ratio is 1.33 or 33% increased chance if you live in a deprived area. But does that reflect propensity in what we're, for want of a better term, calling deprived areas, that there's an increased propensity to carry out the test if you are symptomatic? Because even though there was just over 100,000 people reported back on this study, over 800,000 people were asked to take part. So that's the big weakness, this sort of self-selection bias, really. In adults who received 3 versus 2 vaccine doses, higher CT value, that was the lower viral load, in rounds 15 and 16. So people that had 3 vaccines in round 15 and 16, and of course in round 15 and 16 it was mostly Delta, they had higher CT values, therefore they had lower viral loads. In other words, a third dose was reducing viral load, making severe illness less likely with Delta. But this was not the case with Omicron. So people that had 3 doses of vaccine were not getting lower viral loads with Omicron, which is another aspect of vaccine immune escape that we're seeing with Omicron. Now, this continued on a finding that we've seen in the past rounds, in rounds 15 and 16. The distribution of CT values, in other words, the viral loads, were similar in unvaccinated and vaccinated children aged 17 and below. So the distribution of viral loads was similar in unvaccinated and vaccinated children. Now, what this seems to mean is that whether children are vaccinated or not doesn't influence their viral loads if they become infected, which is interesting. Because this means that if children are infected, whether they're vaccinated or not, is not going to influence significantly how much virus they're shedding, and therefore the likelihood that other members of the family will be infected. So that's an interesting point. Prevalence in those shielding was 3.43% of people shielding, and in those not shielding it was 4.61%. Now that's not a massive difference, given that these people are shielding and these people are not. That's not a huge difference between the two, indicating that you can't really, or at least this proportion of people couldn't shield themselves against Omicron because it is just so transmissible. And the BA2 is even more transmissible than the original Omicron. So shielding looks like it's no longer effectively shielding for that proportion of people. Conclusions. Unprecedented level of infections with SARS-CoV-2 in England. Yep, that's for sure. Almost complete replacement of Delta by Omicron, as we have long anticipated. Vaccination, including the booster campaign, remains the mainstay of the defence. Against hospitalisation, yes. Against infection, no. Given the high levels of protection against hospitalisation, so that's true. So it does give good levels of protection against hospitalisation in people that have not been previously infected. However, further measures beyond vaccination may be required if the very high rates of Omicron infection persist, but they don't quite say what that is. But that brings us on to the World Health Organization quite nicely. So Hans Klung is the European head of the WHO. Between vaccination and natural immunity through infection, Omicron offers plausible hope for stabilisation and normalisation. In other words, it looks like Omicron has saved the situation, according to Hans Klung there from the WHO. Good to see that he's not saying it's WHO advice that's taken, that's helped us out. It's just the fact that we've been sufficiently fortunate to have this Omicron wave. Dr. Tedros, though, the overall boss of the WHO, it's dangerous to assume that Omicron will be the last variant or that we are in the endgame. Well, I think we are in the endgame, actually. On the contrary, globally, the conditions are ideal for more variants to emerge. Well, that is true, as we've seen with this Omicron subvariant, the BA2 has emerged. but it seems to have the same characteristics of Omicron, so we're not particularly worried. It's true that we'll be living with COVID for the foreseeable future. Yes, it is becoming endemic, at least for a period of time. And he says, Dr. Tedros says it's a preventable and treatable disease. Well, preventable? Well, I don't think it is preventable, Dr. Tedros, actually. I think the data we've just shown there on people shielding, if they can't prevent it and they're shielding, then how can anyone else prevent it with anything like a normal life? So I disagree quite profoundly. I don't think it is preventable. And we know that vaccination doesn't prevent against symptomatic disease either. And to talk about treatments, the World Health Organization to talk about treatments really is a bit rich considering their track record on, shall we say, not encouraging certain treatments that have been proposed. So, but anyway, we report what they say. Now, Omicron in New Zealand, what is going on in New Zealand? We could do some video reports from New Zealand because it's hard to see what's going on really. We do know there's some cases, we do know there's some community spread. I'm anticipating that if you live in New Zealand you are going to be infected fairly soon. Same as Western Australia, of course, these places that have been closed off. Omicron will get through and will spread rapidly throughout these populations. And the response of the government in New Zealand, I can't follow it all in detail, but I know that a lot of people in New Zealand are concerned. So this is from a concerned emailer in New Zealand. Now, I do know who this person is, but I haven't got permission to release their name yet. They may allow their name to be released, but I won't release it yet because I haven't got express permission to do so. There were many at the borders in the quarantine system. So lots of people were being caught but being quarantined. But now it's entered society. Very, very hard to quarantine Omicron if you're getting any people coming in out of the country at all. So there is some community spread now in New Zealand, albeit limited. I think at the moment, from memory, it's about 12 cases. It's about 12 to 15 cases per million. So it's only a few, but that's a few tens of cases in the country, and that means Omicron has essentially got a foothold if they're community cases, as they are. So inevitably going to spread throughout New Zealand. Now, the thing about New Zealand is it's got very limited natural immunity. So they are depending on vaccine-induced immunity. Now, that puts them in the same situation as Australia, and we have seen that that works to a large extent. So I am fairly optimistic about it. And of course, the Omicron will give that extra boost of immunity that people get from natural infection. So all of New Zealand's in red. It's not a lockdown. Over 90% vaccinated, almost entirely Pfizer's, with booster now offered to children +5. Okay. You protect your grandma by getting vaccinated is what they're saying in New Zealand. Do you? Because the data we've just looked at, the distribution of CT values for both the E and the N genes was similar in unvaccinated and vaccinated children aged 17 years and below in rounds 15, 16 and 17 of the REACT study. In other words, the viral loads, looking at the viral load of the E and the N genes, the two internal genes, these are the ones that are not affected by vaccination in England. The viral loads were similar in unvaccinated and vaccinated children who became infected. So if children become infected, whether they're vaccinated or not, will not protect grandma. So I don't like this sort of emotional presentation unless it's scientifically accurate, and we see that if children are infected, this is not scientifically accurate, as demonstrated by this study. So I report on what's being done in New Zealand. My comment, this is not my comment, this is the comment of my writer. In order to have such high rates of vaccination, both government sources and media really created a false fear to do so. Sorry to hear that. If you're in New Zealand and this is not your impression, do let me know. Almost bullied those who are not vaccinated with a informal narrative that the unvaccinated could spread while the vaccinated do not. So this old idea that you get vaccinated to protect those around you in the age of Omicron is less accurate. to put it mildly, than it was in Delta. The reason to get vaccinated in New Zealand is to protect yourself from hospitalisation. So I would much prefer to be honest about that. People in New Zealand are no more stupid than the people in England. We respond to truth and reason, not to information which could be construed as being one-sided. We were told that the government has a contract for Novavax as well as Pfizer. Now, this is a bit spooky. What's happened to Novavax protein-based vaccines? Why are we relying entirely on the genetic mRNA vaccines in New Zealand? Why aren't they using adenovirus vector vaccines in New Zealand? Why are they relying entirely on Pfizer? The horrendous models of hospitalisations and death presented on the news were less than accurate, according to this writer. So let's hope he's got the wrong impression there, and that the government of New Zealand is taking people along with them by explaining what is actually true. And just to illustrate this, we did look at this a few days ago, but this is the hospitalisations in California, and this has got massive relevance to New Zealand, because there's not a lot of natural infection. Now, what this shows is that, so the higher up this graph you are, the greater the risk. So this is the worst here. So this line here with people at very high risk for hospitalisation are in people that are unvaccinated with no previous exposure to COVID-19. So to get the risk down, people in New Zealand who've got no previous COVID-19 diagnosis, they haven't been exposed, they need to be vaccinated. And if you're vaccinated in New Zealand, that will take your risk of hospitalisation down from this line down to this line here. You will massively reduce your risk. Now, you won't reduce your risk as much as people that are unvaccinated and have been exposed to the natural infection. But given that that's not an option in New Zealand at the moment, until Omicron comes, the risk from New Zealand is via, the reduction in risk in New Zealand is via vaccination. So it's going to take it down from that level of risk, sort of 16, 18 times more likely to get hospitalised, down to that level of risk there, which is vaccinated with no previous exposure to natural infection. As we've said, natural exposure is better, but that's not an option in New Zealand. And that black line there, which is slightly lower, vaccinated previous COVID-19 diagnosis. So people that have been, actually we can't really separate those lines, that would be, they're basically the same, those lines. And in terms of risk of getting the infection, again, we see the same thing. This is rates of laboratory confirmed COVID-19 cases in New York. And again, we see the unvaccinated are getting many more cases. And if you are vaccinated with no previous exposure, that would bring your risk down to that level. So we are seeing the necessity of vaccinating adults, at least in New Zealand, to reduce that risk. Because while Omicron is less pathogenic, it can still make people sick if they are totally unprotected. And someone is totally unprotected if they've not been vaccinated and not had natural exposure. But I'm looking forward to this sort of benefit, as we see here from people that have had natural infection, very low risks of infection, very low risk of hospitalisation once they've been exposed to Omicron. And we know from Professor Clancy that we can't go on vaccinating because there's a law of diminishing returns with vaccine. So if you've had 2 doses of vaccine, you're protected from symptomatic disease substantially for about 20 weeks. If you've had a 3rd dose, you're protected for about 10 weeks. If you've had a 4th dose, that will go down further. It is not immunologically possible to keep vaccinating people and still have a good immunological response. We have to move on, in my view, to natural infection, but we have to do that while we are still covered by these dramatically effective vaccines, demonstrated they're protecting against cases and demonstrated there protecting against hospitalizations. So you don't want your risk to be up here, you want your risk to be down there, and that is achievable with vaccination, even if you have not been naturally exposed. Okay, there we go. So many things we could have picked to look at today, but that's just what we chose to look at. Oh, now I've been leaving these books here for ages. You can these are my books. These are the books what I writ. So you can download these completely free. So this one's on disease processes. I put lots of diagrams in as well. And this one's on normal body function. So any interested person could read this one on normal body function, I would think, and make a bit of sense of it. Just see how your body works a little bit more. And as we say, those PDFs have made them completely free to download, because that means people in all parts of the world can download them. And there has been lots of downloads, particularly in poor parts of the country, in poor parts of the world, well over 100,000. So that is good. So download the PDFs, put it on your phone. There is a mobile phone friendly version as well as a PC friendly version, and no need to be bored. Okay, thank you for watching.